At dawn, beneath brittle frost and abandoned wreaths, a county snowplow revealed a car half buried beside a rural Wisconsin road. Doors unlocked, engine cold, calendar frozen at December. Evidence whispering that time had stopped here while someone never came back again under silent trees and an unmoving winter sky above. If you like stories like this, make sure to subscribe and like the video. What followed that morning in 1984 unfolded with the quiet gravity familiar to investigators who had worked winters before, when light arrives late and paperwork piles high. The vehicle belonged to 22-year-old Emily Larson, a college senior home for the holidays, last seen after a Thanksgiving visit that stretched toward Christmas. The town was small, stitched together by county routes, grain elevators, and a courthouse whose records smelled of dust and carbon paper. Snowbanks narrowed the streets. Missing person flyers went up on grocery boards and post office cork, their edges curling from indoor heat. Emily's disappearance first registered as a delayed return. Her parents waited through the weekend, then through the Monday when she was expected back at her apartment in Madison. Phone calls went unanswered. A roommate reported the absence. The report was logged with careful neutrality. Officers drove the route Emily would have taken, knotting tire tracks filled by fresh snow. Weather reports were clipped and filed. There was no sign of a crash, no skid marks, no broken glass. The car's position suggested a stop, not an accident. Gas remained in the tank. The keys were missing. An initial canvass focused on the last 48 hours. Bank records showed a modest cash withdrawal days earlier. A gas receipt placed Emily near a county junction on the Wednesday before Thanksgiving. A store clerk remembered a young woman buying coffee, polite, unremarkable, the kind of memory that feels reliable until tested. Witness interviews were typed and initialed. The timeline was pinned to a board that would be revised many times. The first search moved outward from the car. Deputies walked ditches and fence lines with measured spacing. Snow muffled sound and erased impressions. A helicopter could not fly due to low ceilings. Volunteers arrived in knit caps and boots, forming lines that broke when daylight failed. The temperature dropped. By evening, the search was suspended, not ended, with the unspoken understanding that winter dictates its own rules. Days passed. Media coverage was restrained, local papers leading with harvest reports and holiday schedules, then adding a brief column about the missing student. The sheriff's office held to facts. No ransom call came. No credit cards were used. There was nothing theatrical to feed speculation. The case settled into a file with a blue tab, updated with each attempt to move it forward. In early December, a second search extended toward a wooded creek a mile from the road. A boot print was photographed but could not be linked conclusively. A scarf was recovered and logged, later identified as not belonging to Emily. The cold preserved some things and destroyed others. Autopsy considerations were hypothetical, discussed in training terms, because there was no body, only the absence that pressed on each decision. By Christmas Eve, the town gathered as it always had. Church lights glowed against the dark. Snow fell again. Emily's parents sat with detectives reviewing the same pages, their questions answered with care and limits. The investigators noted grief without recording it. Their notes captured dates, times, and the consistency of statements. A neighbor mentioned a pickup seen idling near the junction weeks earlier. The description was vague. It went into the file. January brought a thaw and a discovery that would define the case's first phase. A hiker found remains in a low stand of pines near the creek, partially shielded by brush. The scene was secured. Photographs were taken from measured distances. A medical examiner later determined exposure as a contributing factor, with no immediate signs of catastrophic injury. Clothing matched what Emily had worn. The distance from the road suggested movement after the car was left. The cause of death was listed with caution, the manner undetermined pending further study. The autopsy yielded little that Winter could not explain. There were no obvious defensive injuries preserved. Toxicology was limited by time and conditions. Investigators documented everything that could still speak: fibers, soil on shoes, the pattern of buttons. The findings neither confirmed nor excluded foul play. The file thickened. The months that followed were procedural. Interviews were rerun. Alibis were checked against work schedules and pay stubs. A former boyfriend was cleared by time cards. A coworker's truck was examined and found inconsistent with the earlier description. The case moved between desks as personnel rotated. Each handoff included a summary, the way one generation passes a problem to the next. Thanksgiving returned in 1985 with no resolution. The town remembered. The paper ran a short anniversary piece. The sheriff authorized a review. Hopping distance would sharpen focus. A retired trooper suggested looking again at the car. Photographs were re-examined. A latent print, previously deemed unusable, was flagged for potential future testing, a note written in the margin acknowledging limits. Years passed. Technology changed. The blue tab file became a banker's box. In 2003, a cold case unit cataloged evidence countywide. Emily's scarf, the fibers, the print card were inventoried. DNA testing was discussed and deferred due to cost and degradation. Still, the case remained open, not forgotten, its dates aligning each winter with the quiet rituals of the town. In 2019, a grant funded renewed testing. A technician extracted a partial profile from material preserved beneath a fingernail, overlooked in earlier reviews. The result was incomplete but sufficient for entry into a national index. Months later, a familial association pointed investigators toward a man who had lived near the junction in 1984, then in his 30s, employed seasonally, and still alive. Records were pulled with care. Motor vehicle files placed his pickup on the road network used by Emily that winter. Employment logs showed he clocked out early the night before Thanksgiving. Phone records from the era were sparse, but toll receipts suggested travel consistent with the timeline. Investigators revisited old witness statements and found quiet alignment with the new name. The idling truck recollection sharpened when photographs were shown, not as identification, but as recognition of shape and color. A warrant authorized a consensual interview. The man denied involvement and provided an account that placed him elsewhere. Detectives tested the account without confrontation, checking it against weather reports, payroll stubs, and the recollections of coworkers. Discrepancies appeared in small places, the kind that do not convict alone but invite scrutiny. A search warrant followed, limited and lawful, focused on items retained from decades earlier. Forensic work advanced incrementally. Fibers recovered in 1984 were compared to material found in the suspect's vehicle, preserved through chance in a storage unit. The match was not singular but consistent. Soil analysis linked particles to the creek bank. The partial DNA profile was refined with new techniques, reaching a statistical threshold acceptable to the court. Each step was documented, peer-reviewed, and signed. The winter of 2020 slowed the pace. Courts adjusted schedules. The case moved forward on paper. Prosecutors assembled a narrative grounded in records rather than memory. They anticipated defenses and addressed them with charts and dates. Investigators avoided press until filings were complete, mindful of the town's long wait. By the following Thanksgiving, an arrest warrant was approved. The suspect was taken into custody without incident, a quiet procedure that nonetheless stunned those who had worked the case across decades. A second arrest followed when evidence showed assistance after the fact by an acquaintance who helped move the vehicle. Both men were charged according to their roles. The community response was measured. Headlines were factual. There were no crowds. Emily's parents received a call before the news ran. The courthouse processed the paperwork as it always had, clerks stamping pages beneath fluorescent light. Snow returned to the roads. The case entered its final phase. Pretrial motions addressed evidence handling, chain of custody, and the long interval between discovery and charge. Judges ruled narrowly, allowing the jury to hear what science could now support while excluding conjecture. Investigators prepared exhibits drawn from the same roads and records that began the case. As December approached again, the file that once felt endless gained an ending shaped by patience, law, and winter. The story at this stage remains procedural, awaiting trial, with calendars marked and witnesses listed. For those who carried the file, the work was nearly done, not with relief but with a sober respect for limits. Evidence would speak and the court would decide. Outside, wreaths appeared on doors and the roads froze again, unchanged since the morning the car was found. The investigation, steady and restrained, had reached the point where truth could be tested without spectacle, honoring both the process and the life interrupted, as the town prepared for Christmas under snow. The arrest warrants initiated a phase defined less by discovery than by verification. Investigators returned to the original reports and aligned each modern finding against what had been recorded in 1984, checking that nothing new contradicted the old. Chain of custody logs were reconstructed page by page. Evidence envelopes, yellowed and brittle, were compared to inventory spreadsheets created decades later. Every transfer was accounted for, every signature matched. The integrity of the process mattered as much as the conclusions now emerging. Prosecutors built their case chronologically, beginning not with the arrest but with Emily Larson's final known movements. They reconstructed the Thanksgiving week hour by hour, using bank timestamps, gas station receipts, and academic calendars to explain why she traveled when she did. Weather data from the National Weather Service was introduced to show road conditions and daylight limitations. The narrative remained restrained, focused on what could be shown rather than what might be imagined. The suspect's background was examined with the same care. Employment records established seasonal layoffs that winter, explaining idle time without implying motive. Property records placed him within a short drive of the junction where Emily's car was later found. Prior police contacts were reviewed and deemed irrelevant, excluded to avoid prejudice. The emphasis stayed on actions tied to the specific dates in question. Forensic testimony was prepared to address the limitations inherent in an old case. Experts outlined how preservation techniques in the 1980s differed from current standards and why certain results were unavailable. They explained degradation without dramatization. The partial DNA profile, once marginal, was presented as one element among several, supported by independent corroboration. Statistical language replaced certainty, grounding conclusions in probability rather than assertion. Witnesses were recontacted after years of silence. Some had moved away, others had passed on. Those who remained were interviewed again, their earlier statements read back to them for confirmation. Memory was treated cautiously. Investigators noted consistencies rather than embellishments. The recollection of an idling pickup remained vague, but its presence gained weight when considered alongside vehicle records and timing. The defense filed motions challenging the admissibility of evidence recovered decades later. Hearings focused on whether technological advances altered the meaning of preserved material. Judges ruled that new methods could be applied to old evidence if the original handling met standards of the time. The rulings were narrow and procedural, avoiding commentary on guilt. As winter approached, The courthouse adopted pandemic protocols that slowed proceedings. Calendars shifted. Depositions were scheduled with distance and patience. The town followed updates through brief articles that avoided speculation. The tone remained factual, reflecting a community accustomed to restraint. Emily's family prepared quietly. They reviewed photographs that had been boxed away and reread letters from a period when the future still seemed open. Their participation was limited to statements of fact and identification, their presence a reminder of why precision mattered. Victim advocacy staff coordinated schedules and explained each step without promise. The second suspect, charged with assisting after the fact, agreed to cooperate. His account described helping move a vehicle during a night of snowfall, motivated by loyalty rather than planning. Investigators corroborated details he provided about routes taken and tools used. His statements were tested against weather data and road maintenance logs. Some details aligned, others were corrected. A plea agreement reflected his limited role and the value of his cooperation. Trial preparation emphasized clarity. Exhibits were designed to show distances and times without drama. Maps highlighted county roads familiar to jurors. Photographs of the car's discovery were included sparingly, chosen for informational value rather than impact. The goal was understanding, not reaction. Expert witnesses rehearsed explanations of soil comparison and fiber analysis, translating technical language into accessible terms. They acknowledged margins of error. Cross-examination was anticipated and addressed in advance. The case rested on accumulation rather than any single piece. When the trial began, it did so in late December, the courthouse decorated modestly for the season. Proceedings followed routine. Jurors were instructed carefully, reminded of the burden of proof and the passage of time. The prosecution presented its case in measured segments, each building upon the last. There was no attempt to reconstruct emotions, only events. The defense countered by highlighting gaps inherent in a cold case. They emphasized lost evidence and faded memories. Prosecutors responded by returning to records that had not changed, dates, locations, physical traces. The contrast underscored the importance of documentation. As testimony concluded, the focus shifted to deliberation. Jurors reviewed exhibits in a room warmed by radiators, the winter light fading early outside. They asked for clarifications on timelines and forensic explanations. No questions sought speculation. The process unfolded deliberately, mirroring the investigation itself. A verdict was reached after careful consideration. The primary suspect was found guilty on charges consistent with the evidence presented. The cooperating accomplice received a reduced sentence in accordance with his agreement. The judge read the decision without flourish, outlining the reasoning grounded in law. Sentencing occurred weeks later after New Year's Day. Statements were brief and factual. The court imposed a term reflecting the severity of the crime and the years that had passed without resolution. There was acknowledgement of both loss and process, of harm addressed through lawful means. In the aftermath, the sheriff's office closed the file with a final memorandum summarizing the case from start to finish. Copies were archived digitally and on paper. Investigators who had inherited the case across generations noted the conclusion with quiet satisfaction, aware that resolution did not restore what was lost, but affirmed the value of persistence. The town marked another winter. Roads froze and thawed. Life continued in familiar patterns. Emily Larson's name moved from the missing persons list to a record of resolved cases, her story preserved in files and memory. The case demonstrated how patience, documentation, and evolving science could converge, even after decades, to bring clarity without spectacle. After sentencing, attention turned to the administrative work that follows a resolved homicide. Evidence was reviewed for final disposition, with some items retained for appeal and others cleared for return or destruction according to statute. The laboratory issued a concluding report that summarized methods used, results obtained, and limitations acknowledged. Each page was logged, signed, and archived. The discipline of closure mirrored the discipline of investigation, emphasizing record over reaction. An appellate notice was filed within the standard window, anticipated by the prosecution and prepared for in advance. The grounds focused on evidentiary rulings and the application of contemporary forensic methods to historical material. Briefs cited precedent and procedure rather than disputing facts. The court scheduled review for the following term, ensuring continuity without urgency. The case entered a quieter phase, measured by filings rather than headlines. Local media revisited the story with care. Reporters relied on court documents and avoided narrative excess. The articles contextualized the outcome within the county's history, noting changes in technology and staffing across decades. Editorials emphasized process, reflecting a readership that valued method and restraint. There were no commemorations beyond a brief acknowledgement at the courthouse flagpole on the anniversary of Emily Larson's disappearance. Within the sheriff's office, training sessions used the case as a study in documentation. New deputies examined how early decisions affected later options, how evidence preserved imperfectly could still speak. The lesson stressed humility before time and the importance of careful notes. The case became part of institutional memory, not as a legend but as a reference. The forensic archive retained representative samples for educational purposes. Labels included dates and handling instructions, reinforcing chain of custody principles. Technicians updated protocols to reflect advances while respecting the constraints faced by earlier practitioners. The continuity between past and present was treated as a professional obligation. Emily's family engaged with the Victim Services Unit to complete administrative steps, including restitution forms and notification preferences. Their participation was limited and structured, designed to prevent re-traumatization. The process acknowledged loss without extending it. Records reflected their choices without commentary. In the town, winter events proceeded as they always had. The holiday parade followed the same route. Snow removal schedules were posted at the municipal building. The case's resolution did not alter daily rhythms. It settled into the background, a known fact rather than an open question. The appellate court issued its opinion months later, affirming the trial court's rulings. The decision outlined why the evidence met admissibility standards and how the jury instructions properly framed the issues. The language was technical and precise. With that, the legal process concluded, barring extraordinary relief. A final entry was made in the cold case registry, updating the status to resolved. The registry's criteria were met: identification, lawful conviction, and verified evidentiary linkage. The update included cross-references to related cases and training materials. It was a small action with symbolic weight. Investigators reflected privately on the span of years involved. Some had retired, others had begun their careers after the case first opened. The continuity had depended less on individuals than on systems designed to persist. That realization reinforced confidence in the method even as it underscored its limits. The physical landscape remained unchanged. The county road where the car was found still curved through fields and pines. A small marker installed by the family stood discreetly near the creek, permitted by the landowner. It bore no dates beyond the year, aligning with the family's preference for simplicity. Archival photographs were digitized and made accessible to researchers under controlled conditions. The purpose was transparency, allowing future review if standards changed again. The county's policy favored access balanced with privacy, reflecting lessons learned. As another Thanksgiving arrived, the paper published a brief retrospective noting the case's conclusion the prior year. It cited the appellate decision and the importance of grants that funded renewed testing. The tone remained reserved. Readers recognized the value of patience. In training rooms and conference spaces, the case was discussed alongside others, not elevated above them. The emphasis stayed on procedure, how to re-examine assumptions, how to integrate new tools without overreaching, how to respect the record. The narrative resisted personalization. For those closest to the work, the resolution brought a subdued satisfaction. There was no sense of triumph, only confirmation that careful adherence to process could narrow uncertainty. The outcome did not answer every question, but it addressed the central one within the bounds of law. The case underscored the role of season and environment. Winter had obscured evidence and delayed discovery, shaping the investigation's early course. Later winters framed anniversaries that prompted review and funding. Weather became a factor not as drama but as context. Records from 1984, once typed and filed, now existed in digital form, searchable and secure. The transition preserved content while changing access. The permanence of data contrasted with the fragility of memory, reinforcing why documentation mattered. The suspect entered the correctional system, where intake assessments recorded age, health, and placement considerations. The system processed the outcome without reference to publicity. Sentences were administered according to policy. The accomplice served a reduced term and was released under supervision, conditions documented and monitored. The quiet aftermath extended beyond the courthouse. The family's choices about remembrance were respected. The community returned to ordinary concerns. The case's lessons persisted in policy and practice rather than ceremony. As December closed, snow fell again across the county. Plows cleared the same routes, including the bend where the car had been found decades earlier. The scene no longer carried uncertainty. It existed as a location with a history understood, recorded, and resolved. The story of Wisconsin 1984 concluded not with spectacle but with files closed, systems affirmed, and a life acknowledged through careful work. The investigation demonstrated how methodical persistence, grounded in records and science, can reach across time to deliver lawful closure, even when winter once seemed to erase everything. The closing months after resolution were defined by routine rather than reflection. Agencies completed compliance audits, confirming that notifications had been sent, appeals logged, and evidence retention schedules set. The process emphasized completion over commentary. Nothing further was required of investigators except availability should questions arise. The case moved from active memory into institutional record. County officials reviewed grant outcomes, noting how limited funding had produced measurable results when paired with disciplined review. Recommendations were forwarded to the state task force, emphasizing targeted testing and careful prioritization. The lesson was practical. Old cases benefit most from narrow questions asked patiently. The report avoided nomming individuals, focusing instead on methods and timelines. In classrooms where criminal justice was taught, the case appeared briefly as a study in procedural endurance. Students examined how weather, time, and resource constraints shaped decisions. The material stressed caution against hindsight bias. What seemed obvious later had not been so earlier, and judging past actions required context. That restraint echoed the tone of the investigation itself. The town's historical society accepted a sealed copy of the public record for long-term preservation. Access rules were clear. Researchers could review documents under supervision, ensuring transparency without intrusion. The society's curator cataloged the file among others that charted the county's development, treating it as civic history rather than spectacle. Emily Larson's academic institution acknowledged the conclusion with a brief note in an alumni bulletin. It summarized the facts without elaboration and reaffirmed commitments to student safety. The note was factual and respectful. It avoided imagery and avoided emotion, consistent with the community's preferences. Law enforcement leadership updated policy manuals to reflect clarified standards for cold case reviews. Emphasis was placed on evidence triage, digital conversion, and interagency coordination. The changes were incremental, reflecting an understanding that systems improve through small, sustained adjustments. For those who had worked the case early in their careers, retirement brought perspective. They recalled winter patrols and paper files, the limits of what could be known. The resolution validated their careful notes and measured decisions. It did not erase uncertainty, but it affirmed the value of consistency. The physical artifacts associated with the case were handled according to law. Personal items were returned to the family or disposed of respectfully. Laboratory samples were retained as required. The vehicle, long since released, existed only in photographs and reports. Each disposition was logged. Seasonal cycles continued to mark time. Thanksgiving dinners occurred in the same halls. Christmas lights appeared along the same streets. The case no longer surfaced in conversation, not because it was forgotten, but because it had found a place. Closure, in this sense, meant containment within records rather than ongoing attention. At the courthouse, clerks closed the docket and archived transcripts. The final judgment was indexed and cross-referenced. The system reflected completion through small indicators. A status field updated, a folder moved, a schedule cleared. These changes were mundane yet definitive. The broader implication of the case lay in its demonstration that resolution does not require spectacle. It requires patience, lawful process, and respect for uncertainty. The evidence did not shout. It accumulated. The narrative did not rely on confession or coincidence. It relied on alignment between records and science. In the years ahead, technology would continue to change. New methods might revisit old materials. Policies would adapt. The case stood as an example of how to integrate advances without rewriting history. The past remained intact, understood within its limits. The suspect's incarceration proceeded without incident. Reviews followed standard intervals. The system treated the outcome as one among many, administered according to rule. The accomplice's supervision concluded as scheduled, documented, and unremarkable. The family's private remembrance continued away from public view. Their choices guided how the case was referenced. Agencies honored those preferences. Respect was operationalized through restraint. As winter returned again, snow settled over fields and roads. Plows traced familiar paths. The bend in the county road remained ordinary, its significance held in files rather than signs. The landscape did not commemorate. The record did. Ultimately, the Wisconsin 1984 case resolved through the convergence of persistence and proof. It showed how time can obscure and reveal, how winter can delay but not defeat careful work. The outcome affirmed that lawful closure is possible even after decades, achieved not by force of narrative but by steady adherence to process.